In the autumn of 1813, as Emperor Jiaqing sat reviewing poetry in the tranquil gardens of the Forbidden City, a breathless messenger burst through the palace gates with news that would haunt the Qing Dynasty forever. Armed rebels had not only breached the outer walls of his sacred domain, but had come within sword's length of the Son of Heaven himself. What made this assault even more shocking was not just its audacity, but its architects, a ragtag army of peasant women who had abandoned their kitchens and silk looms to wage holy war against the richest empire on earth. This was no ordinary uprising. For nearly a decade, the White Lotus Rebellion had transformed the most docile members of Chinese society, rural women bound by centuries of Confucian submission, into fearless warriors who believed they were hastening the arrival of the Buddha's paradise. Led by charismatic prophets who preached that the end times had arrived, these 70,000 women shattered every social convention of Imperial China, creating a revolutionary sisterhood that nearly toppled a dynasty that had ruled for over 150 years. Their story is one of mystical visions and brutal warfare, of desperate faith colliding with imperial power, and of ordinary people who dared to believe they could remake the world through sacred violence. The lotus flower that would become the symbol of history's most dangerous peasant rebellion first bloomed not in temple gardens, but in the smoke-filled back rooms of village tea houses where desperate farmers gathered to whisper about the end of the world. By 1796, as the Qing Dynasty celebrated the 60th year of Emperor Qianlong's reign with lavish festivals, a very different kind of celebration was taking root in the mountains of Hubei province, one that would transform an ancient Buddhist sect into the empire's most terrifying nightmare. The White Lotus Society had existed for centuries as a peaceful religious movement, its adherents quietly practicing meditation and charitable works while venerating the Eternal Mother, a Buddhist goddess who promised salvation to the faithful. But in the famine-ravaged villages of central China, this gentle mysticism was rapidly mutating into something far more dangerous. Traveling preachers began appearing at local markets, their eyes burning with prophetic fervor as they proclaimed that the Kalpa, the cosmic cycle of destruction and rebirth, was finally at hand. The corrupt Qing Dynasty, they declared, represented the forces of darkness that must be swept away before the Buddha's paradise could descend to earth. What made these sermons electrifying was not just their apocalyptic message, but their revolutionary promise of equality. In a society where women were expected to remain silent and invisible, White Lotus teachers proclaimed that in the coming paradise, all souls, male and female, rich and poor, would stand equal before the Eternal Mother. They taught that the Buddha himself had been reborn as a peasant woman, and that salvation would come not through imperial power or Confucian scholarship, but through the faith of ordinary people who had been scorned by the world. The transformation from prayer circle to underground network happened with stunning speed. What began as evening gatherings to recite sutras soon evolved into elaborate initiation ceremonies conducted by moonlight in remote temples. New converts learned a secret vocabulary that allowed them to identify fellow believers. White meant loyal to the sect, while black indicated imperial forces. A simple question about the weather, is it cloudy or clear, could reveal whether a stranger was friend or deadly enemy. Women who had never spoken above a whisper in their lives began memorizing coded messages and organizing clandestine supply networks that stretched across 3 provinces. The imperial government, distracted by palace intrigues and border conflicts, remained oblivious to the spiritual revolution brewing in their countryside. Local magistrates dismissed reports of unusual religious activity as harmless superstition, failing to grasp that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in Chinese history. A mass movement that promised not just political change, but cosmic transformation. The lotus was no longer merely a symbol of enlightenment, It had become a battle cry that would soon echo from the mountains of Sichuan to the gates of the Forbidden City itself. While the White Lotus faithful prepared for the end of the world, the Qing Empire was inadvertently hastening its own apocalypse through a toxic combination of corruption, natural disaster, and imperial delusion. The same year that secret lotus societies began sprouting in village temples, Emperor Qianlong abdicated his throne to his son Jiaqing, in what appeared to be an act of filial piety, but was actually a desperate attempt to preserve the fiction of his glorious reign, while reality crumbled around him. The new Emperor Jiaqing inherited an empire that looked magnificent from the gilded halls of the Forbidden City, but was rotting from within, like a beautiful apple with a worm-eaten core. His father's favorite minister, Hessian, had transformed imperial administration into a personal cash machine, selling government positions to the highest bidder and skimming percentages from every transaction that flowed through Beijing. Provincial governors, knowing their posts were temporary and expensive, arrived in their territories with one goal: extract enough wealth to repay their initial investment and secure a comfortable retirement before their inevitable recall. This cascade of corruption reached its most devastating effects in the countryside, where local magistrates treated their districts like personal ATMs. Tax collectors became bandits with official seals, demanding payments that often exceeded a family's annual income while pocketing half for themselves. Village headmen, caught between impossible imperial quotas and increasingly desperate peasants, began cooking their books with creative fiction that would have impressed the court poets. On paper, the empire was prosperous and peaceful. In reality, millions of farmers were selling their children to pay taxes on crops that had failed years ago. Nature itself seemed to conspire against the dynasty. The Yellow River, that great symbol of imperial legitimacy, had been growing increasingly unstable as centuries of deforestation upstream sent massive loads of silt downstream. Local officials, more concerned with immediate profits than long-term infrastructure, had allowed the critical dikes and channels to decay while reporting fictional maintenance projects to Beijing. When the inevitable floods came in 1796, they didn't just destroy crops. They obliterated entire communities, leaving hundreds of thousands of refugees wandering the countryside with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a burning hatred for the government that had abandoned them. The emperor's response to these mounting crises revealed the fatal disconnect between the Forbidden City and the real China beyond its vermilion walls. While peasants starved and provinces burned, Jiaqing concerned himself with palace ceremony and scholarly debates about proper Confucian etiquette. His daily briefings from provincial governors painted a picture of minor disturbances quickly resolved by competent officials, omitting the inconvenient details of mass starvation, refugee camps, and growing whispers about divine punishment for imperial sins. This willful blindness would prove catastrophic when the White Lotus Rebellion finally erupted. An empire that had convinced itself it was still the prosperous realm of the great Kangxi emperor was about to discover that its actual subjects had concluded their government was not just incompetent, but actively evil. A regime so corrupt that heaven itself demanded its destruction. The stage was set for the most dangerous peasant uprising in Chinese history, led by people who had literally nothing left to lose. Lu Jixie looked like the least likely candidate to topple an empire. A failed scholar from Hubei province with calloused hands and threadbare robes, he had spent years wandering from village to village, earning copper coins by teaching children their characters and performing minor healing rituals for desperate farmers. But behind his humble exterior burned a vision so radical and compelling that it would transform him from an obscure country teacher into the most wanted man in China. The transformation began in 1794, when Liu experienced what he claimed was a divine revelation while meditating in a mountain cave near his home village. The Eternal Mother herself, he declared, had appeared to him in a blaze of golden light, revealing that the cosmic cycle was nearing its end and that he had been chosen as her earthly messenger. More shocking still, she had told him that the Buddha would soon return to Earth, not as a prince or emperor, but reborn as a peasant woman who would herald the arrival of paradise for the downtrodden masses. What made Lu's message explosively dangerous was not just its apocalyptic content, but its revolutionary social implications. In a society where women ranked barely above livestock in the Confucian hierarchy, Lu preached that the coming paradise would be ruled by the divine feminine principle. Men and women would stand as equals before the Eternal Mother, he proclaimed, and those who had been last in the corrupt imperial order would be first in the Buddha's kingdom. To crowds of exhausted farmers who had watched their daughters sold into slavery to pay imperial taxes, this wasn't just prophecy, it was justice. Lu's genius lay in his ability to weaponize traditional Buddhist concepts for revolutionary purposes. The ancient doctrine of karma, he explained, proved that the Qing Dynasty's corruption had doomed it to destruction, while the Buddhist concept of the kalpa, the great cycle of cosmic death and rebirth, meant that violent resistance to evil rulers was not just permissible, but spiritually necessary. Those who died fighting the imperial forces wouldn't simply go to heaven, he promised. They would be instantly reborn in the coming paradise as beings of pure light. By 1796, Lu had gathered around him an inner circle of disciples who helped spread his message with evangelical fervor. They developed a sophisticated recruitment system that targeted the empire's most desperate citizens: war widows, displaced farmers, unemployed artisans, and especially women whose families had been destroyed by the cascade of imperial failures. New converts underwent elaborate initiation ceremonies where they swore blood oaths to the Eternal Mother and received sacred charms that supposedly made them invulnerable to imperial weapons. The movement's growth was meteoric and terrifying. What had begun as one man's mystical visions quickly evolved into a sophisticated underground network spanning hundreds of villages across 3 provinces. Lu's followers established secret schools where women learned to read the sacred texts alongside men, created hidden supply caches filled with weapons and grain, and developed communication systems that could coordinate simultaneous uprisings across vast distances. Most dangerously of all, they began actively recruiting within the imperial army itself, promising soldiers that they could wash away their sins by turning their weapons against their corrupt officers. By the winter of 1798, imperial intelligence finally began picking up whispers about the scope of what they were facing. But by then it was too late. Lu Jixie had created something unprecedented in Chinese history: a religious movement that promised cosmic transformation through revolutionary violence, led by a prophet who had convinced his followers that heaven itself commanded them to destroy the established order. The powder keg was packed, the fuse was lit, and the explosion that would shake the Qing dynasty to its foundations was only months away. On a moonless night in March 1799, something extraordinary happened in the village of Laoshan that would have been unthinkable just months before. As imperial soldiers slept in their barracks 20 miles away, 73 women crept from their homes, abandoning sleeping husbands and children to gather in an abandoned temple where they performed a ritual that shattered 2,000 years of Chinese social order. One by one, they cut off their hair, the mark of feminine virtue, and swore a blood oath to the Eternal Mother that they would never again bow to any earthly man. This scene was repeated in hundreds of villages across central China, as Lu Jixie's revolutionary message ignited a gender revolution that no one, including Lu himself, had fully anticipated. What had begun as spiritual promises of equality in the afterlife was rapidly becoming a demand for equality in the here and now. Women who had spent their entire lives speaking only when spoken to suddenly found themselves organizing military units, stockpiling weapons, and preparing for holy war against the most powerful empire on Earth. The transformation was as swift as it was shocking. Wang Cong'er, a silk weaver from Xiangyang whose husband had been beaten to death by tax collectors, became one of the first to embrace the new order. Instead of mourning in traditional widow's weeds, she donned men's clothing and began recruiting other women for what she called the Eternal Mother's Army. Within weeks, she commanded a force of over 1,000 female fighters who had abandoned their cooking pots for spears and their embroidery needles for daggers. The psychological impact of this mass defection from traditional roles cannot be overstated. In a society where women were taught from birth that their highest virtue was obedience, first to fathers, then husbands, then sons, these White Lotus converts were committing what amounted to cosmic treason. They stopped binding their feet, discarded their jewelry, and began practicing martial arts in secret courtyards while their families slept. Most scandalously, they declared themselves spiritually equal to men, and began preaching Lu Jixie's revolutionary gospel to other women with evangelical fervor. The rebellion's female leadership developed their own command structure that operated parallel to but independent from the male hierarchy. They created all-female military units with their own officers, supply networks, and strategic objectives. These units proved devastatingly effective because Imperial forces had no protocols for fighting women. Confucian military doctrine assumed that female combatants simply could not exist. When government troops encountered armed women on the battlefield, they often hesitated fatally, unable to reconcile their training with the reality of enemies who should have been home tending their children. Perhaps most revolutionary of all was the theological justification these women developed for their rebellion. Drawing on Lu Jixie's teachings but expanding them in directions he had never envisioned, female White Lotus leaders proclaimed that the Eternal Mother had grown tired of watching her daughters suffer under male tyranny. The coming paradise, they declared, would not just feature gender equality, it would be ruled by women, with men serving as junior partners in the new cosmic order. This wasn't just political revolution, it was a complete inversion of the natural order that had governed Chinese society since the dawn of civilization. By the summer of 1799, imperial officials were receiving reports that defied belief. Entire villages where women had abandoned their homes to join armed rebel bands, female generals commanding mixed-gender armies, and most terrifying of all, organized networks of women who were actively recruiting soldiers' wives and daughters to betray their own families. The empire that had prided itself on the virtue and docility of its women suddenly found itself facing an enemy that included tens of thousands of female warriors who believed they were fighting not just for political change, but for the liberation of their entire gender. The unthinkable had become reality. Chinese women had declared war on the system that had oppressed them for millennia, and they were winning. In the flickering candlelight of a mountain stronghold near Xiangyang, 3 women sat planning the destruction of an empire while their male counterparts slept. Wang Cong'er, the silk weaver turned general, traced battle formations on a rough wooden table with her dagger tip. Beside her, Qi Liner, a former temple servant who had become the rebellion's most feared cavalry commander, sharpened the blade that had already claimed the lives of 6 imperial officers. Across from them, the woman known only as Teacher Yang studied stolen government documents with the intensity of a scholar, though no academy would have ever admitted her. These 3 represented the extraordinary leadership that emerged when the White Lotus Rebellion shattered traditional barriers and allowed talent to rise regardless of gender or birth. Wang Cong'er had transformed from a grieving widow into a master strategist whose tactical innovations would puzzle imperial generals for years. Her signature maneuver, the Lotus Formation, arranged infantry in overlapping circles that could defend against cavalry charges while creating devastating crossfire zones. More remarkably, she had developed these tactics not through military training, which was forbidden to women, but by applying the geometric patterns she had learned as a silk weaver to the deadly art of war. Qi Linner's path to prominence was even more improbable. Born to a family of horse traders, she had grown up around the animals that most Chinese women were forbidden to ride. When the rebellion erupted, she assembled the White Lotus Cavalry Corps from scratch, teaching farm girls to fight from horseback, using techniques she had invented by watching Imperial patrols from hiding places in the mountains. Her riders became legendary for their speed and ruthlessness, appearing from nowhere to strike Imperial supply convoys before vanishing like ghosts into the forest. Imperial commanders learned to fear the sound of galloping hooves in the night, knowing it likely meant Qi Linner's butterfly cavalry, named for their ability to flutter just out of reach before delivering a fatal sting. The most enigmatic of the three was Teacher Yang, whose real name was never recorded in any surviving document. What is known is that she had somehow learned to read and write at an advanced level, despite being born into a family of tenant farmers. She became the rebellion's intelligence chief, running a network of female spies who infiltrated imperial households as servants and concubines. Her agents fed her detailed information about troop movements, supply routes, and, most dangerously, the personal habits and weaknesses of key imperial officials. It was Teacher Yang who discovered that the garrison commander at Fangxian had a weakness for gambling, allowing the rebels to bribe his subordinates and capture the fortress without a fight. The emergence of these female leaders created a command structure unlike anything in Chinese military history. While male White Lotus generals focused on traditional siege warfare and pitched battles, their female counterparts pioneered what would later be called guerrilla tactics. They understood intuitively that a peasant rebellion could never match the empire's resources in direct confrontation, so they developed strategies based on mobility, deception, and psychological warfare. Wang Conger perfected the art of the false retreat, luring imperial forces into carefully prepared ambushes by appearing to flee in panic. Qi Linner's cavalry units became masters of night raids, striking at imperial camps when soldiers were most vulnerable and disappearing before organized resistance could form. Teacher Yang's spy network allowed the rebels to stay one step ahead of imperial manhunts, receiving advance warning of planned attacks and sometimes even turning imperial agents into double operatives. Perhaps most importantly, these women created a parallel military culture that challenged every assumption about warfare in traditional China. Their forces practiced a fluid command structure where orders could come from any direction, making them nearly impossible to decapitate through targeted assassinations. They pioneered the use of coded songs and religious chants to coordinate complex maneuvers across vast distances, turning traditional women's activities into military communication systems. The psychological impact of their success reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Every imperial defeat at the hands of female commanders sent shockwaves through a society that had convinced itself that women were naturally inferior in all matters requiring courage and intelligence. The empire's most fundamental assumptions about gender, authority, and the natural order were crumbling along with its military position, creating a crisis of confidence that reached all the way to the dragon throne itself. Dawn was breaking over the village of Bailigang when the White Lotus warriors began their most terrifying ritual. As imperial troops approached through the morning mist, expecting to find cowering peasants, they instead encountered 2,000 rebels kneeling in perfect formation, chanting sutras with voices that rose like thunder across the valley. What happened next would haunt imperial soldiers for the rest of their lives. The rebels rose as one, their eyes blazing with religious ecstasy, and charged directly into the government forces' musket fire without a trace of fear. This was sacred violence, warfare transformed into religious sacrament through the White Lotus belief that death in battle was merely a doorway to paradise. The rebels had weaponized Buddhist compassion itself, teaching their followers that killing imperial soldiers was not murder but spiritual liberation, freeing corrupt souls from their earthly suffering and sending them toward their next reincarnation. To die fighting the forces of darkness was to achieve instant enlightenment. To live in victory was to hasten the arrival of the Buddha's kingdom on earth. The transformation of gentle Buddhist farmers into fearless holy warriors began with elaborate pre-battle ceremonies that fused ancient meditation practices with military preparation. Rebel units would gather before dawn, burning incense and chanting the Lotus Sutra, while their leaders painted sacred symbols on their faces with cinnabar and ox blood. The women warriors developed their own rituals, weaving lotus flowers into their hair and reciting prayers to the Eternal Mother while sharpening their weapons. These ceremonies served a dual purpose. They convinced the rebels that supernatural forces protected them, while terrifying Imperial soldiers who had never faced enemies who seemed eager to die. The rebels' battle tactics reflected their apocalyptic worldview in ways that confounded traditional military thinking. Instead of retreating when outnumbered, White Lotus forces would often attack with suicidal courage, convinced that the Eternal Mother would multiply their strength 100-fold. They developed a fighting style that emphasized spiritual purification through combat, believing that each enemy killed brought them closer to cosmic enlightenment. Their war cries were Buddhist mantras, their battle formations were arranged in sacred geometric patterns, and their weapons were blessed in elaborate ceremonies that transformed ordinary farm tools into holy instruments of divine justice. Wangconger elevated this religious warfare to an art form. Before major battles, she would enter a trance state that her followers believed allowed her to commune directly with the Eternal Mother. Emerging from these sessions with detailed tactical instructions that she claimed came from heaven itself, she could convince her troops to attempt seemingly impossible maneuvers because they believed divine forces guided every movement. Her famous victory at Dadianzi was won when she convinced her outnumbered forces to attack uphill against entrenched imperial positions by promising them that the Buddha himself would turn their arrows into lightning bolts. The rebels also pioneered psychological warfare techniques that exploited their enemies' superstitions and fears. They timed their attacks to coincide with solar eclipses and other astronomical events, claiming these were signs of heaven's displeasure with the Qing Dynasty. Their spies spread rumors that White Lotus warriors could transform into tigers or disappear into thin air, while captured Imperial soldiers were subjected to elaborate purification rituals designed to demonstrate the rebels' supernatural powers. Some government forces became so demoralized by these tactics that entire units defected without ever engaging in battle. The most disturbing aspect of White Lotus sacred violence was its complete moral certainty. Unlike conventional rebels who might question the justice of their cause, these warriors believed they were literally fighting alongside celestial armies in a cosmic war between good and evil. This conviction made them almost impossible to negotiate with. Imperial officials who tried to arrange surrenders were told that the rebels could no more lay down their arms than the sun could stop rising because both were expressions of divine will. The religious intensity that made White Lotus forces so formidable also contained the seeds of their eventual destruction. Their absolute faith in supernatural protection made them vulnerable to setbacks that more pragmatic rebels might have survived. When promised miracles failed to materialize, or when charismatic leaders were killed in battle, the psychological impact could shatter entire units overnight. But for nearly a decade, sacred violence made a ragtag collection of desperate peasants into the most dangerous enemy the Qing Empire had ever faced. Warriors who fought not just for victory, but for the salvation of the world itself. Emperor Jiaqing was enjoying his morning tea in the Garden of Perfect Brightness when the courier arrived with news that would transform him from a complacent ruler into a man fighting for his dynasty's survival. The message, written in the shaking hand of the governor of Hubei, contained just 3 devastating sentences. "Your Majesty, the White Lotus rebels have captured Xiangyang. Our entire garrison has either fled or joined their ranks. I humbly request immediate reinforcements of 50,000 troops." The teacup shattered against the marble floors. The full implications hit the emperor like a physical blow. Xiangyang wasn't some remote frontier outpost. It was a major administrative center, home to 30,000 people, and the key to controlling the Han River Valley. For rebels to capture such a prize meant this was no longer a local disturbance that could be handled by provincial militias. This was a full-scale insurrection that threatened the very foundations of imperial power. What followed was the most frantic mobilization in Qing military history. Within hours, the Forbidden City became a hive of desperate activity as ministers who had spent years focused on palace intrigue suddenly found themselves planning for total war. Messengers galloped through the empire's relay stations, carrying imperial edicts that activated every military unit from Manchuria to Guangdong. The emperor's own banners, the elite Manchu forces that had conquered China a century and a half earlier, received orders to march south immediately, abandoning their comfortable Beijing barracks for a campaign that would test whether they had retained any of their ancestors' fighting spirit. General Fukangan, the empire's most experienced military commander, was summoned from his retirement to take charge of the counteroffensive. A grizzled veteran of the Tibetan campaigns, he arrived at court to find an emperor who had aged years in a matter of days. "How many troops do you need?" Jiaqing asked without preamble. Fukangan's answer revealed the true scope of the crisis. "Every soldier we have, Your Majesty, and it may still not be enough." The general's first strategic assessment painted a picture that terrified the imperial court. The rebels controlled a territory roughly the size of modern France, encompassing critical river valleys and mountain strongholds that would require massive resources to recapture. Worse, their forces were growing daily as desperate peasants flocked to join what appeared to be a winning cause. Intelligence reports spoke of rebel armies that materialized from nowhere, struck imperial positions with devastating effectiveness, then vanished into landscapes where every village provided shelter and every farmer was a potential spy. Fukangan's initial military response followed conventional imperial doctrine: overwhelming force applied with ruthless efficiency. He assembled an army of 80,000 troops, the largest force deployed against internal rebels in over a century, and began a systematic campaign to crush the White Lotus strongholds one by one. But the rebels refused to fight the kind of war imperial generals understood. Instead of defending fixed positions where superior imperial numbers could be brought to bear, they melted away before advancing government forces, only to reappear hundreds of miles away to devastate supply convoys and isolated garrisons. The psychological impact on imperial forces was devastating. Soldiers who had expected to face ragged peasants armed with farm tools instead encountered disciplined units led by commanders who seemed to anticipate their every move. The rebels' religious fervor proved especially unnerving. Government troops reported facing enemies who sang hymns while charging into battle and who seemed genuinely eager to die for their cause. Morale plummeted as rumors spread that the White Lotus warriors possessed supernatural powers and that heaven itself had withdrawn its mandate from the Qing Dynasty. By winter of 1799, Fukangan was forced to send a humiliating report to Beijing. Despite deploying massive resources and winning several tactical victories, the rebellion was stronger than ever. The general's proud professional army had been fought to a standstill by a force that shouldn't have been able to challenge a single imperial regiment. For the first time in his long military career, Fukangan found himself wondering whether the rebels might actually be right about divine intervention, because nothing else could explain how untrained peasants were making the imperial war machine look like a collection of bumbling amateurs. The dragon had awakened, but it was discovering that rousing from slumber was easier than actually catching the lotus flowers that seemed to bloom wherever its fire couldn't reach. The siege of Xiangyang began on a crisp autumn morning in 1800 when General Fukingan's artillery opened fire on the ancient city walls with a thunderous barrage that could be heard 50 miles away. What the Imperial commander expected to be a brief demonstration of overwhelming firepower instead became a 9-month nightmare that would define the entire White Lotus War. Behind those walls, 20,000 rebels had transformed a provincial city into a fortress of faith that would test every assumption about what desperate people could accomplish when they believed heaven itself was watching. Wang Conger had spent months preparing Xiangyang for siege with an ingenuity that would have impressed military engineers from any era. The city's traditional defenses were formidable enough: massive stone walls 30 feet high and 20 feet thick, built to withstand medieval siege engines. But Wang had added innovations that reflected both her textile background and her growing understanding of imperial military doctrine. She ordered the weaving of enormous rope nets that could catch cannonballs and absorb their impact. Then had these nets mounted on wooden frames that could be quickly repositioned as needed. More remarkably, she created a system of underground tunnels that connected every major building in the city, allowing defenders to move unseen and turning Xiangyang into a 3-dimensional battlefield. The rebels' most devastating innovation was psychological. Wang Conger understood that besieged defenders typically broke when they lost hope, so she created an elaborate system of signs and portents designed to convince her followers that divine intervention was imminent. Each successful defense was proclaimed as evidence of supernatural protection, while every imperial setback was interpreted as proof that heaven had abandoned the Qing Dynasty. She established workshops where craftsmen created miraculous weapons: arrows painted with phosphorus that glowed in the dark, spears blessed with sacred oils that seemed to penetrate armor with impossible ease. Whether these weapons were actually more effective mattered less than the unshakable confidence they gave to rebels who faced impossible odds. The siege quickly developed into a deadly chess match between Wang Conger's creativity and Fukingan's overwhelming resources. The imperial general commanded 60,000 troops, hundreds of artillery pieces, and supply lines that stretched back to Beijing itself. But every conventional tactic he employed was met with responses that seemed to come from military manuals that hadn't been written yet. When his sappers tried to tunnel under the walls, they found that the rebels had dug counter-tunnels that allowed them to flood the imperial excavations with boiling oil. When artillery bombardments breached sections of the wall, the attackers discovered that Wang had prepared secondary defensive positions that turned each breach into a killing field. The human cost mounted with each passing week. Imperial forces launched assault after assault against walls defended by rebels who fought with the fervor of martyrs. Women warriors stood alongside men on the ramparts, raining arrows and stones down on attackers while chanting sutras that turned the battlefield into a bizarre fusion of monastery and charnel house. The rebels had developed tactics that maximized their spiritual impact on both attackers and defenders. They would display captured imperial banners upside down as symbols of dynastic collapse, while their own flags bore religious symbols that proclaimed the coming of paradise. Winter brought new horrors as starvation began to affect both sides. Fukingan's massive army consumed supplies faster than they could be replaced, while rebel foraging parties continued to harass imperial supply convoys with devastating effectiveness. Inside Xiangyang, Wang Conger instituted strict rationing while maintaining the religious ceremonies that kept morale high. She claimed that the Eternal Mother was testing their faith through hunger, and that those who died of starvation would be reborn as celestial beings in the coming paradise. Incredibly, this message resonated. Even as people weakened and died, there were virtually no defections from the rebel ranks. The siege's climax came in spring 1801, when Fukangan launched a final, desperate assault using nearly his entire force. For 3 days and nights, Imperial troops fought their way through breached walls and burning buildings in the most savage urban combat of the entire rebellion. Wang Conger commanded the defense from a temple tower, her voice carrying across the battlefield as she directed resistance with tactical brilliance and religious inspiration in equal measure. When Imperial forces finally reached the temple complex, they found it empty, except for a message painted on the walls in characters large enough to be read from across the courtyard. The lotus blooms eternal. We have gone ahead to prepare paradise. Wang Conger and her core followers had vanished into the tunnel system, escaping with most of their remaining forces while leaving behind a city reduced to rubble and ash. Fukangan had technically won the siege, but at a cost that made victory taste like defeat. His army was exhausted, demoralized, and reduced by nearly half, while the rebels they had sought to destroy had simply melted away to fight another day. Most ominously, word of Xiangyang's heroic defense was already spreading throughout rebel-controlled territory, transforming Wang Conger from a military commander into a legend whose very name could inspire desperate peasants to attempt the impossible. Emperor Jiaqing was reviewing memorial tablets in the Hall of Supreme Harmony when the first scream echoed through the corridors of the Forbidden City. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The Son of Heaven stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what his ears had just heard. Then came the clash of steel on steel, the thunder of running feet, and the impossible, terrifying realization that armed rebels had somehow penetrated the most sacred and secure location in the Chinese Empire. The attack had begun at dawn on September 15, 1813, with a precision that spoke of months of careful planning and inside knowledge that reached to the highest levels of imperial administration. Lin Qing, a White Lotus leader who had spent years building a network of converts within the palace staff, had coordinated the assault with the cold calculation of a master strategist. Dozens of rebels, disguised as servants and laborers, had infiltrated the palace over previous weeks, smuggling weapons piece by piece and memorizing the labyrinthine layout of corridors that most courtiers never saw. The rebels struck simultaneously at multiple gates, their knowledge of palace routines allowing them to bypass the outer defenses with shocking ease. At the Gate of Divine Might, 2 kitchen servants who had secretly joined the White Lotus 3 years earlier overpowered the guards and opened the massive doors to admit their confederates. At the East Flowery Gate, a eunuch who had been recruited through promises of spiritual salvation led a group of rebels directly to the Imperial Guard's armory. Within minutes, the most secure fortress in China had become a battlefield, where Imperial bodyguards found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who knew the palace better than they did. What made the assault truly terrifying was not just its audacity, but its religious motivation. These were not bandits seeking treasure or political opportunists hoping to seize power. They were true believers who had come to complete what they saw as a divine mission. Lin Qing had convinced his followers that killing Emperor Jiaqing would trigger the immediate arrival of paradise on Earth, transforming their assassination attempt into a sacred duty that justified any sacrifice. They fought with the desperate courage of martyrs, turning palace courtyards into scenes of carnage as they battled through waves of Imperial guards toward their ultimate target. The Emperor's survival came down to minutes and the quick thinking of a handful of loyal bodyguards who managed to barricade the doors to the Hall of Supreme Harmony just as the rebels reached the outer chambers. For nearly an hour, Jiaqing, the ruler of the world's largest empire, crouched behind an overturned table while the sounds of battle raged just yards away. Through the ornate windows, he could see rebels in the palace gardens, some already wounded, but still fighting with religious fervor that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The palace's salvation came from an unexpected source. Prince Mianning, the emperor's second son, who rallied the scattered imperial guards with a display of personal courage that would define his character for the rest of his life. The future emperor Dao Guang seized a crossbow from a fallen guard and personally led the counterattack, his presence inspiring the demoralized defenders to mount a coordinated resistance. The tide turned when imperial reinforcements arrived from the nearby garrison, but not before the rebels had penetrated to within 50 yards of the emperor himself. The aftermath was almost as shocking as the attack itself. Interrogations revealed that the conspiracy had tentacles reaching throughout the imperial bureaucracy, with White Lotus sympathizers occupying positions from palace eunuchs to provincial governors. The discovery that rebels could recruit followers from within the government's own ranks shattered the court's confidence in ways that military defeats never could. If the emperor wasn't safe in his own palace, surrounded by guards who had sworn their lives to protect him, then nowhere in the empire could be considered secure. Lin Qing's capture 3 days later did little to restore imperial confidence. Under torture, he revealed details of a conspiracy so extensive and well-planned that it seemed impossible that mere peasants could have conceived it. The rebels had studied palace routines for years, bribed key officials, and even infiltrated the imperial kitchens with the goal of poisoning the emperor if the direct assault failed. Most disturbing of all, Lin Qing showed no remorse for his actions, proclaiming even as he faced execution that the Eternal Mother would soon punish the dynasty for its crimes against heaven. The psychological impact of the palace assault reverberated throughout the empire. If rebels could penetrate the Forbidden City itself, then every imperial official began to wonder who among their own staff might be secret White Lotus converts. Paranoia became the dominant emotion in government circles as the emperor ordered massive purges of palace personnel and launched investigations that would eventually claim thousands of lives. The rebellion had achieved something that no military victory could have accomplished. It had made the imperial court afraid of its own people, transforming the confident rulers of China into haunted men who saw potential assassins in every servant's smile. In the frozen mountains of Sichuan, as winter snow began to fall in late 1807, Wang Cong'er stood before the remnants of her once mighty army and saw her own death reflected in their hollow eyes. The woman who had commanded 20,000 followers at the height of the rebellion now led fewer than 800, most of them wounded, all of them starving. The empire's new strategy was working with devastating effectiveness. Instead of chasing rebel armies through the countryside, imperial forces were systematically destroying everything that could sustain them: villages, crops, livestock, and hope itself. The shift in imperial tactics had begun 2 years earlier when a new generation of commanders replaced the aging Fukangan, who had died of exhaustion and frustration in 1805. General Yang Yuchun, his successor, was a different breed of soldier, younger, more ruthless, and unburdened by any romantic notions about honorable warfare. Where Fukangan had tried to defeat the rebels through conventional military means, Yang understood that the White Lotus drew its strength from the sympathy and support of the civilian population. His solution was as simple as it was savage: eliminate the population. Yang's Scorched Earth campaign transformed entire provinces into wastelands. Imperial troops received orders to destroy any village that had provided aid to the rebels, with aid defined so broadly that it included selling them food, offering shelter to their wounded, or simply failing to report their presence to government authorities. Whole communities that had lived peacefully for centuries suddenly found themselves facing a choice between starvation and collaboration with increasingly desperate rebel bands. Most chose neither, fleeing their ancestral homes to become refugees in a landscape that offered no sanctuary. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. Yang's forces made public examples of captured rebels that were designed to break the spirit of their followers. White Lotus prisoners were subjected to elaborate tortures before execution, with particular attention paid to the female fighters who had so challenged Imperial sensibilities. The Empire wanted to demonstrate that the supernatural protection the rebels claimed was nothing but peasant superstition, and that the Eternal Mother was powerless to save her most devoted disciples. Huangkonger's personal transformation reflected the broader tragedy engulfing the rebellion. The brilliant tactician who had once outmaneuvered entire Imperial armies now found herself reduced to leading desperate raids for basic supplies. Her followers, who had once believed they were hastening the arrival of paradise, now fought simply to survive another day. The religious fervor that had sustained them through years of hardship was gradually being replaced by the grim pragmatism of people who had seen too much death to believe in miracles. The rebels' communication networks, once their greatest advantage, began to work against them as Imperial intelligence services learned to intercept and decode their messages. Yang's spies, many of them former White Lotus members who had been turned through a combination of torture and promises of clemency, provided detailed information about rebel movements and supply caches. The mystical bond that had once united scattered rebel bands across 3 provinces was dissolving into mutual suspicion and paranoia. Perhaps most devastating was the Empire's systematic targeting of the rebellion's spiritual infrastructure. Imperial forces made special efforts to capture and execute White Lotus teachers and religious leaders, understanding that these figures were irreplaceable in ways that military commanders were not. When the elderly sage Master Zhou was captured and publicly burned alive in the market square of Ankang, his death sent shockwaves through the rebel ranks that no military defeat could have achieved. The man who had taught that suffering was an illusion, died screaming, and his agony seemed to prove that the entire spiritual foundation of the rebellion had been built on lies. The rebellion's final strongholds became death traps rather than sanctuaries. Imperial forces would surround rebel positions and simply wait, knowing that starvation and disease would accomplish what direct assault could not. The mountain fortresses that had once seemed impregnable became tombs where rebels died not in glorious battle but from typhus, dysentery, and the slow despair of watching their children waste away. Huangkonger herself began to change in ways that terrified her remaining followers. The woman who had once radiated confidence and divine inspiration now spoke increasingly of death and endings. She stopped making long-term plans, ceased promising future victories, and began preparing her followers for what she called the final flowering of the lotus, a phrase that everyone understood to mean mass suicide rather than surrender. The Empire had not just defeated the White Lotus Rebellion, it had broken the spirit of the remarkable woman who had led it, transforming a symbol of female empowerment into a tragic figure preparing to choose death over dishonor. The tide had indeed turned, but the cost of that victory would leave scars on both sides that would never fully heal. The last battle of Huangkonger began, not with the clash of armies, but with a single arrow that whistled through the morning mist of the Xiangyang gorge. The projectile struck a rock inches from where she knelt in meditation, its steel point still vibrating as she opened her eyes to see 10,000 Imperial soldiers emerging from the fog, like vengeful spirits. General Yang Yuchen had finally cornered the woman who had humiliated his forces for nearly a decade, and he intended to make her death a spectacle that would end the White Lotus Rebellion forever. Huangkonger rose to her feet with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had made peace with mortality. Around her, the last 300 White Lotus warriors prepared for what they knew would be their final battle. These were the survivors of a dozen campaigns, veterans who had followed their commander through years of victory and defeat. Many bore scars from Imperial weapons, all bore the deeper wounds of watching their revolution crumble into desperate flight. Yet as they faced impossible odds in a narrow gorge with no possibility of escape, something of their old fire returned. The battle that followed became legend even among the Imperial troops who fought it. Wang Conger had chosen her final battlefield with the tactical brilliance that had made her famous. The narrow gorge channeled the Imperial forces into a killing field where superior numbers counted for nothing. Her warriors fought with the concentrated fury of people who knew they were writing the rebellion's epitaph in blood and steel. They had transformed the rocky defile into a fortress of death, with carefully prepared positions that maximized every advantage the terrain could provide. But this was no ordinary last stand. As the battle raged, Wang Conger began a ritual that struck terror into both her enemies and her own followers. Standing exposed on a boulder that made her a perfect target for Imperial archers, she began to chant the death songs of the White Lotus, ancient hymns that promised transformation through sacrifice. One by one, her surviving commanders joined her on the rock, their voices rising above the clash of weapons in harmonies that seemed to come from another world entirely. The Imperial soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that had transcended normal human psychology. White Lotus warriors who suffered mortal wounds continued fighting until they collapsed. Their dying breaths used to sing praises to the Eternal Mother. Women who had lost their weapons picked up stones and hurled them at Imperial shields while reciting sutras. The rebels were not just dying, they were performing an elaborate sacrament that transformed military defeat into spiritual victory. Yang Yuchen later wrote that the most unnerving moment of the battle came when Wang Conger suddenly stopped singing and spoke directly to his advancing troops. Her voice carried across the battlefield with impossible clarity as she proclaimed that their deaths would plant seeds of revolution that would bloom in future generations. She promised that the Empire's victory would be hollow because it had revealed the rottenness at the heart of Imperial power. Most disturbing of all, she spoke of her followers as if they were already dead, describing their ongoing battle as the final movements of ghosts who had chosen to haunt their oppressors. The end came with shocking suddenness. As Imperial forces finally overran the rebel positions, Wang Conger made a choice that denied her enemies the satisfaction of capture. With a cry that echoed off the gorge walls like the call of a mythical bird, she leaped from her rocky perch into the churning waters of the Longwang River, far below. Her body was never recovered, leading to legends that persist to this day about her transformation into a river spirit who continues to protect those who fight against injustice. Her death signal triggered a coordinated suicide among the surviving rebels that horrified even hardened Imperial veterans. Rather than surrender, the remaining White Lotus warriors threw themselves into the river, off cliffs, or onto their own weapons while singing hymns of liberation. Within minutes, a battle that had seemed to promise rich captures for interrogation had produced only corpses, and a silence broken only by the rushing water that had claimed the rebellion's greatest leader. Yang Yuchun's triumph tasted like ashes. He had eliminated Wang Conger, but her final battle had demonstrated something far more dangerous than military skill. It had shown that the White Lotus could transform defeat into martyrdom, creating a legacy that might prove more powerful than any victory they had achieved in life. The general's dispatches to Beijing described a complete victory, but privately he worried that he had not killed a rebel leader, so much as he had created a saint whose memory would inspire future generations of malcontents. Across the empire, the news of Wang Conger's death was received with a mixture of relief and unease. The rebellion's most dangerous military commander was gone, but the manner of her death had created a powerful symbol that the empire would struggle to suppress. In hidden temples and secret gatherings, her name was already being whispered alongside those of legendary heroes who had chosen death over dishonor. The White Lotus Rebellion was ending, but its martyrs were just beginning their immortal careers as inspiration for everyone who dreamed of a world where heaven's justice would finally triumph over earthly power. The final White Lotus stronghold fell not with the thunder of artillery, but with the whisper of winter wind through empty courtyards. The mountain fortress of Dadianzi, which had once housed 5,000 rebels preparing for the Buddha's paradise, surrendered in February 1808, when its last defender, a teenage girl whose parents had died fighting for the cause, walked out carrying a white flag made from her own burial shroud. General Yang Yuchun, arriving to claim his ultimate victory, found himself standing in a city of ghosts where the only sounds were his own soldiers' footsteps and the distant howling of dogs feeding on corpses that no one had survived to bury. The arithmetic of destruction that followed the rebellion's collapse was staggering even by the brutal standards of Imperial China. Yang's meticulous reports to Beijing documented the systematic execution of over 30,000 prisoners, the destruction of more than 1,500 villages, and the displacement of nearly 1 million people across 3 provinces. Entire family lines had been extinguished, their names erased from local records as if they had never existed. The empire's message was unmistakable. Rebellion against the mandate of heaven would be punished not just in this life, but in the complete obliteration of memory itself. Yet even as the empire celebrated its victory, the true cost of the war was becoming horrifyingly apparent. The treasury, already strained by decades of corruption, had been bankrupted by 9 years of constant military operations. The war had consumed an estimated 100 million taels of silver, roughly equivalent to 3 years of total imperial revenue, while destroying the agricultural infrastructure that generated that wealth in the first place. Entire prefectures that had once contributed grain and taxes to Beijing now required imperial relief just to prevent mass starvation. The human cost transcended simple mathematics. In the rebellious heartland of Hubei and Sichuan, imperial forces had created what later scholars would recognize as demographic catastrophe. Whole counties had been depopulated through a combination of warfare, execution, and flight, leaving behind empty villages where weeds grew through the floors of abandoned temples. The imperial policy of collective punishment had created a generation of orphans and widows whose hatred for the government would simmer for decades, creating the conditions for future uprisings that would eventually topple the dynasty itself. Emperor Jiaqing's victory proclamation, issued from the Forbidden City in March 1808, revealed a ruler who had aged beyond his years during the crisis. Gone was the confident tone of earlier imperial edicts. In its place was the defensive posture of a man who had learned to fear his own subjects. The proclamation spoke at length about the divine protection that had preserved the dynasty. But between the lines lay a clear admission that the empire had nearly been destroyed by people it had dismissed as ignorant peasants. The emperor, who had once believed in the natural order of imperial superiority, now posted guards at his bedroom door and tasted his food with silver chopsticks. The rebellion's suppression revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Qing system that no amount of military victory could address. The corruption that had sparked the uprising remained endemic. The natural disasters that had driven people to desperation continued unabated, and the social tensions that had made millions receptive to revolutionary prophecy were arguably worse than before. The empire had won the war by applying overwhelming brutality, but it had not solved any of the underlying problems that had made the war necessary in the first place. Perhaps most ominously, the White Lotus Rebellion had demonstrated something that would haunt the Qing Dynasty for the remainder of its existence. The empire was vulnerable to popular uprising in ways that its rulers had never imagined. The myth of imperial invincibility had been shattered along with the villages of central China. Local officials who had once governed through a combination of tradition and mild coercion now required permanent military garrisons to maintain order. The easy confidence that had characterized Qing rule for over a century had been replaced by the paranoid vigilance of an occupying force in hostile territory. The rebellion's legacy would prove more durable than the empire that suppressed it. In the hidden corners of Chinese society, The story of Wang Conger and her warrior sisters became a whispered legend that would inspire future generations of revolutionaries. The Taiping rebels of the 1850s would explicitly invoke White Lotus precedents, while the Boxer Uprising of 1900 would resurrect many of the same spiritual practices and anti-government rhetoric. Even the communist revolutionaries of the 20th century would claim the White Lotus rebels as predecessors in the struggle against imperial oppression. The price of paradise, it turned out, had been paid not just by the rebels who died pursuing it, but by an empire that had sacrificed its own moral authority to prevent its realization. The Qing Dynasty would survive for another century, but it would never again be the confident, expansive power that had once commanded the respect of the world. The White Lotus Rebellion had not destroyed the empire, but it had revealed the empire's capacity to destroy itself through the very brutality it employed to maintain control. In seeking to preserve their version of the natural order, China's rulers had demonstrated that their power rested not on heaven's mandate, but on their willingness to transform their own country into a charnel house, rather than accept change. In a dusty archive beneath the Imperial Academy in Beijing, a young scholar named Sun Yat-sen discovered something in 1894 that would change the course of Chinese history. Hidden within a collection of documents marked Provincial Disturbances, Classified, he found the secret memorial that General Yang Yuchen had submitted to Emperor Jiaqing in 1809, 1 year after the White Lotus Rebellion's official end. The general's private assessment was stark. "Your Majesty, we have won this war, but in doing so we have taught our enemies how to fight the next one." Yang's prophecy proved chillingly accurate. The rebellion's tactical innovations, guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, mass recruitment of women, and the transformation of religious fervor into military advantage became the blueprint for every major uprising that would shake China over the next century. The Taiping rebels, who nearly toppled the Qing in the 1850s, explicitly studied White Lotus methods, with their leader, Hong Xiuquan, declaring himself the spiritual heir to Lu Jixie's revolutionary vision. Even more remarkably, they recruited thousands of women into combat roles, creating all-female military units that terrified imperial forces, just as Wang Conger's warriors had done 50 years earlier. The ghost of the White Lotus Rebellion haunted the Forbidden City long after its last stronghold had fallen. Every imperial crisis triggered fears that another messianic movement might emerge from the countryside, leading to increasingly paranoid responses that often created the very conditions they sought to prevent. When the Boxer Uprising erupted in 1900, foreign observers noted the eerie similarities to the White Lotus movement, the same fusion of religious mysticism and anti-government violence, the same promises of supernatural protection, the same recruitment of society's most desperate members. The imperial court's response, brutal suppression followed by foreign intervention, completed the cycle of dynastic self-destruction that the White Lotus Rebellion had begun. But perhaps the most remarkable echo came in the 1920s, when a young revolutionary named Mao Zedong discovered Wang Conger's story while researching peasant uprisings in the Hunan Provincial Library. The future chairman of Communist China was reportedly transfixed by accounts of her tactical brilliance and her ability to transform oppressed women into revolutionary fighters. Mao's later writings on guerrilla warfare contain passages that seem directly inspired by White Lotus methods, particularly the emphasis on winning popular support through providing justice where the government had failed. The parallels between Wang Conger's revolution and Mao's would prove uncanny. Both movements emerged from regions devastated by government corruption and natural disasters. Both promised to overthrow an ancient social order and create paradise for the common people. Both relied heavily on the participation of women who had been marginalized by traditional society. Most remarkably, both succeeded in creating disciplined armies from untrained peasants through a combination of religious-like ideology and innovative military tactics that confounded conventional forces. The difference, of course, was that Mao's revolution succeeded where Wang Congers had failed. When the People's Liberation Army entered Beijing in 1949, Chinese women marched alongside their male comrades as equals, something that would have been unthinkable without the precedent set by the White Lotus warriors 150 years earlier. The new communist government, while officially atheist, borrowed heavily from the White Lotus tradition of promising cosmic transformation through revolutionary violence. They even adopted the rebels' practice of creating elaborate martyrdom narratives that transformed military defeats into spiritual victories. Today, in the museums of modern China, visitors can find carefully curated exhibits about the White Lotus Rebellion that describe it as a proto-democratic uprising against feudal oppression. These sanitized displays omit the more disturbing aspects of the movement: the religious fanaticism, the mass suicides, the willingness to destroy entire communities in pursuit of spiritual goals. But they preserve the essential truth that Yang Yuchun had recognized 2 centuries earlier. The rebels had discovered something powerful and dangerous about the relationship between faith, desperation, and political change. The ultimate irony may be that the White Lotus Rebellion succeeded in ways its leaders never intended. Wang Cong'er and her followers believed they were hastening the arrival of the Buddha's paradise through sacred violence. Instead, they had discovered the template for modern revolutionary warfare, the methods that would eventually bring down not just the Qing Dynasty, but the entire imperial system that had governed China for over 2,000 years. Their lotus had indeed bloomed eternal, but in forms that would have been unrecognizable to the desperate peasants who first planted its seeds in the mountains of central China. In the end, the 70,000 women who defied heaven had achieved something far more lasting than the paradise they had died seeking. They had proven that history's most oppressed people could become its most dangerous revolutionaries when they found something worth dying for. That lesson, written in blood across the provinces of Imperial China, would echo through the centuries until it finally brought down the walls of the Forbidden City itself.